Welcome everyone to the webinar to launch the National Connection Guideline, the Frameworks and Principles Guideline by Energy Networks Australia. Today, myself, who is Stuart Johnston, who is the General Manager for Network Transformation at Energy Networks Australia, and Melanie Corner, who's a Principal Consultant at Cutler Mertz, will be presenting on the first of the guidelines that we're producing as part of the project to develop national connection guidelines for DER, particularly for the DNSPs. In today's, if people have got questions throughout the webinar, there's a text box on the side of the webinar where you can actually provide any of your comments or questions that we can try and answer at the end of the webinar. We're hoping to have about 20 to 25 minutes to actually go through some of those questions. We obviously won't get to everybody's question, and so we may go through and be a little bit selective in terms of trying to choose those. However, if we don't get to yours, we are going to try to intend to come back to you at the end at a later date to actually make sure that we actually answer or get back to people on any queries or issues that they've got around the presentation today. In terms of what we're looking at doing as part of this webinar, the whole idea is to basically quickly go over an overview, background and objectives of the actual project. I'll then flick across to Melanie, who's going to go through the actual document that we're actually launching today, which is the Frameworks and Principles Guideline, and some of the key aspects in terms of how we actually developed it, how we actually did that consultation to actually and made some of the decisions around those, and some of the key aspects in that document, particularly around connection types, technical requirements, and then the next component was around some of the key challenges we identified as part of that, and actually go through some of the rationale on why we made some of those decisions. And then the last part will be around the next steps around which will be the next part of this project, which will be around developing the technical guideline development that will come out of these, and the timeframes around that, and also how people can get and engage in being part of that process as well. And then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. So just going back to to why this project actually occurred in the first place, from Energy Networks Australia's perspective. Obviously, about 12 months ago, we launched the roadmap, which identified a number of key significant operational capabilities that were required, and including things like grid design, operation, forecasting, increased data transparency. But one of the other key aspects that was identified through that process was developing consistent connection requirements, which was actually mirrored by lots of other studies that had actually been done out there as well. So it wasn't just the work that we did ourselves; it was actually mirrored by work from people like the Clean Energy Council and Climate Works, etc., etc. So it was seen as an imperative that a piece of work was done in this area to actually try and develop some guidelines that were actually that provided more consistency across the board. This got picked up as one of our key, as part of the implementation of the roadmap, was picked up as one of our key flagship programs. So this piece of work has actually been it was actually picked up by the networks themselves, so it's actually been driven by that, and then also been driven by and funded to actually develop these by the network. So they did identify this was a key issue to actually address, and actually agreed that we needed to actually do this piece of work, to work with all of the key stakeholders to develop these national guidelines because of the issues that have been identified. So what are the National DER Connection Guidelines? Well, the whole idea of these documents are to set out the framework, principles and approach around the technical settings for Australian network service providers to adopt in the development and application of their technical requirements for connection of DER. The aim of the guidelines is to facilitate the efficient integration of DER into the grid from the perspective of both the network and the proponents, and to try and give a more clearer requirements from both sides, I suppose, in making sure that networks know exactly what they need to and how they need to actually set that information out and what the proponent does, make it a lot clearer for them in terms of what they need to actually do or provide to actually fast track or make sure that they're actually meeting the requirements to connect to the grid. These are guidelines and are a voluntary industry code. However, all of the network service providers, as part of actually doing this project in the first place, but also through the process of actually developing this document, but also going forward, have communicated their intention to actually adopt the requirements of the guidelines going forward. The objectives obviously go back to some of the things that were actually identified through those studies that have been done over the last couple of years in this area, which gave rise to issues around giving clear and complete technical requirements for grid connection, and it's in a standardised process, so it's consistent. So we're asking for that information in a consistent manner across the DNSPs, and ensuring that the technical requirements give regard to the long-term interests of consumers by applying that balance the economic benefits, costs and risks that the requirements impose upon the network and proponents, but also for the proponent itself. In terms of the scope of, this applies to grid connections of any generating unit to an Australian distribution network. At the moment, we're not actually looking for at the transmission level. However, we are looking at high voltage within the distribution system. Now, that could actually, as we actually get into the technical guidelines and their development, there has been talk with some stakeholders that this could be extended to the transmission, but that is something that needs to be reviewed and looked at a later date. At the moment, this project is specifically around the distribution networks at the moment. In terms of the terminology, this does not include registered generators, but it does include all small registered generators and registered small aggregation generators. It includes both exporting and non-exporting units. It includes all technology with potential to generate electricity, including battery storage. But at the moment does not include demand response, except we're also able to generate electricity. So it's around just storage in your PV system in terms of demand response, but not around demand response with air conditioners or hot water systems, etc., etc. And in terms of the requirements, we're looking particularly at the technical requirements and the process requirements. But we're only looking at those process requirements in the existing legislative requirements that are there at the moment. The whole idea is if those legislative requirements change, then these documents would be updated to match those changes. So who are these guidelines actually applying to? So obviously the person it directly applies to is the distribution network service providers, for them to directly adopt this in the development and application of their technical requirements for grid connection of DER. It's unlikely at this stage to actually go for the transmission providers. However, that's going to be considered as we go along, as I said before. In terms of the proponents, it's going to be utilised by them to navigate and understand the technical requirements for connection to the Australian networks, and for them to utilise as the guidance to actually give them for that connection process. Particularly as the technical guidelines for the size of unit or whatever they're trying to put on the system comes on board. For the AER, it's going to be to actually assist in determining whether the technical requirements as proposed by the DNS are fair and reasonable, and other stakeholders to actually navigate and understand the technical requirements of connection to Australian networks. And again, to provide that basic information for them to know what they need to do. Going forward, so once we're actually, as I said, we're launching this framework and principles guideline, which basically specifies the framework and requirements, and has outlined requirements for how we actually build the technical guidelines going forward. Once we've actually, as I said, after this launch, we're then going to be going into a piece of work around actually developing the actual technical guidelines, which are we're looking at the moment a basic connection technical guideline, which specifies the technical requirements for basic connections. We're looking at one for low voltage connection technical guidelines for other connections to a low voltage network. The medium voltage technical guideline, connection of larger DER at the medium voltage network, and of course the last one's around connections to the high voltage system. We'll go into more specifics about how we actually chose those, and there is some conjecture about the medium voltage at the moment in terms of do we go ahead with that because of there might be some slight differences between some networks in terms of where that sits, but at the moment, because of the consensus view that we got from stakeholders through this process, we are looking at doing the four. Hopefully that sets up a bit of an overview of how we got there and what this is going to cover this morning. I'm going to hand over to Melanie now to then start taking you through the process of actually how we actually developed the National Frameworks and Principles Guideline.
Great, thank you, Stuart. So as Stuart said, my name is Melanie Kerner. I'm a Principal Consultant at Cutler Mertz, and we've been supporting Energy Networks Australia in developing the Framework and Principles Guideline. What I'm going to talk through today is the Framework and Principles Guideline, so we're leaving the detailed technical guidelines aside to talk about the document that's being launched today, which is the Framework and Principles Guideline, which is now available on Energy Networks Australia's website. So if you did want to have a look, I think we've got a link that we'll post, and that's now available for viewing. The process we went through to develop the Framework and Principles Guideline, back in December of last year we conducted a webinar, which I think many of the people on today's webinar were also in attendance at that webinar, where we were introducing the project and heard some of the initial priorities and concerns for the connection guidelines. After that stage, we undertook 2 surveys to understand preferences. So I've got on the slides that those surveys were undertaken by key stakeholders, and I will outline who they are. But with the technical survey we undertook from all of the Australian network service providers, and that was to ask them what they currently produce in terms of their technical requirements, how many guidelines, what type of guidelines, what types of connections they currently use, and what technical requirements those guidelines cover. Then we also issued the non-technical survey to key stakeholders, and that was specifically focused on this Framework and Principles Guideline, asking what sort of audience it should be made for, what sort of aspects should it cover, and what was the broad structure that they were expecting from that guideline and the subsequent guidelines as well. Out of that survey, we then started to craft the structure of the guideline, and we presented those survey results to a steering committee, which was comprised of Clean Energy Council, Australian Energy Regulator, Australian Energy Market Commission, the Australian Energy Market Operator, and each of the network service providers through the Energy Networks Australia's committee members. From there, we then heard feedback from that steering committee and then began drafting of the guideline. That guideline has then been reviewed by those same steering committee members, received really valuable comments from that group of people, and then finalised until we're launching today. The non-technical survey, so these were the spread of survey respondents that we did receive. So in terms of transmission network service providers, only the 2 we received responses from, and I think that sort of gave us an indication that at this stage the transmission connection process is being handled through other forums. The DNSPs, distribution network service providers, we had all distribution network service providers respond, which was great. We had various government departments respond, industry bodies, and the proponents, and this was undertaken via the Clean Energy Council. So that's the process of reaching out to proponents was undertaken by the Clean Energy Council, and they received responses from the proponents listed there. So in terms of who responded, there was broad, mostly the DNSPs where we got the greatest response rate from, but also able to reflect the views of other stakeholder types through the survey approach. The survey results, so we had a couple of, well, for the most part there was, we were able to easily discern what stakeholders wanted. They overwhelmingly wanted us to produce a guideline that would tell the NSPs how to produce the technical requirements, that the guideline shouldn't necessarily be aimed at proponents, but it should educate proponents as to what to expect from NSPs. So in that respect, we've produced a guideline which speaks in instructional language and speaks to network service providers around what they need to consider and do in developing their technical requirements. Stakeholders wanted us to provide definitions of connection types. There was a recognition that network service providers are using different definitions for connection types at the moment, and there is a lack of consistency. Even though there is some connection types prescribed by the National Electricity Rules, there is certainly room to go beyond the rules to more precisely define connection types, which technical requirements should be produced. Our stakeholders wanted us to provide process requirements. Now, this wasn't initially necessarily part of the scope. It was definitely focused on technical requirements, but there was a view that process requirements should be included in the document, but a strong view that we shouldn't be making up any new process requirements. We should only make those consistent with existing regulations. And the reason for that is that we didn't want this document to be quickly outdated if new process requirements were introduced, which we understand happens relatively regularly through the National Electricity Rules rule change process. Where stakeholders differed was in terms of how we should talk about connection types. So there was almost a 50-50 split actually between network service providers in particular around whether the guidelines should be specified in terms of the connection voltage, or they should be split in terms of the capacity of systems or the size thresholds and the technology type. So that was a key challenge, which we'll go through later in terms of why we landed at the final position, which was specifying the guidelines in terms of connection voltage. And there was a mixed view around the separate guidelines for battery storage, and also a mixed view around network service providers' queuing policies, how they treat multiple applications at the same connection point. And I'll go through each of these issues. The final structure of the guideline you'll see on this page. We have a forward which sort of gives the background to the project and where we are at this point in time. And I think eventually it may be that we get rid of that forward, but it really is an introduction to the guidelines as a point in time where we are in the process and where the industry currently stands with connections. Then the formal guidelines, sections 1 through to 6, is a very, it's written almost like a standard instructing NSPs around the requirements they need to adhere to if they're going to comply with this guideline. A general introduction, and then connections is section 1. Section 2 is around the high-level network and proponent obligations when a connection to the network is made. Section 3 then starts defining the framework in terms of the connection types that we've defined within this document. Section 4 is the process requirements, and again these process requirements are largely based on existing regulations and legislation. We're not introducing any new process requirements. The exception to that is in section 4.7, where we deal with queuing policy, where we are asking network service providers to make their queuing policy or the way they deal with multiple applications at the same connection point to make that transparent, and that's a new process requirement. But other than that, sections 4.1 through to 4.8 are a reiteration or an interpretation and clarification of existing rules. Section 5 then sets out the structure for the technical requirements for each of the connection types. Now, these aren't the technical requirements themselves. They'll be outlined in the subsequent guidelines, which we're starting to produce in the next stages. Section 5 is almost a table of contents with a general instruction around what that section of the technical requirements should contain. The aim here is that network service providers can now take that structure, adapt their existing technical guidelines to match that structure, and that way we're getting some quick wins in terms of all network service providers have technical requirements which are structured the same way, contain the same categories of technical requirements, even though until we produce the technical guidelines, the requirements won't necessarily be equivalent or read the same way. Section 6 is the document management section, which talks about how we're going to review and evaluate whether these voluntary guidelines are being complied with, whether we're achieving the aims which Stuart talked through around consistency, clarity, completeness. We'll be evaluating through a series of reviews and third-party evaluations. Okay, so the connection types that we've defined, 5 basic connection types in there. The basic micro-embedded generation connection is the sort of mums and dads domestic scale connection that that's most common at the moment, typically at a 230 volt or the mains voltage. The technology type, so it's a micro-embedded generator, which is an inverter-based technology and must be compliant with AS4777. Now, AS4777 does extend to 200 kVA, but the basic micro-embedded generation connection defined in this guideline only goes up to 30 kVA for a 3-phase connection. We have also specified a 10 kVA single-phase connection. Now, there were a few issues around this particular one because obviously here we're specifying a technology capacity threshold, and networks have different thresholds at the moment for their basic connection. We've chosen 30 kVA as we feel that that's best practice towards which a number of networks are moving towards. The 10 kVA single phase was a bit contentious because that becomes difficult to achieve in rural networks for phase imbalance reasons. And so we have included the potential for networks who operate in rural areas to reduce that to 5 kVA and to a minimum of 5 kVA, and where they do that, to specify which local government areas that 5 kVA may apply to. So this will be interesting to see whether we are able to achieve compliance. The guidelines also do say that networks are able to have alternative settings to those that are prescribed in the guidelines, but where they do so, they need to be justified based either on jurisdictional legislative requirements or that they believe that the alternative setting is more efficient or is more efficient from the perspective of both proponents and networks, and that should be justified. So although we specify these thresholds, there are potential ways that networks may have an alternative setting, but again, that's something that will be evaluated as we go on. The low voltage connection, so this will be any connection to a network up to 1 kV that's not a basic connection. So this will be of basically any technology from inverter based. It will be anything that's greater than the basic connection. And we're also asking networks to then set their own maximum threshold about what a low voltage connection can accommodate. So I think feedback we've got that networks at the moment is around 1 megawatt, 1.5 megawatts, typically the size that can be accommodated sort of behind the meter. That's the larger size, but we're leaving it up to NSP to specify that typical maximum capacity that can be accommodated. And for non-inverter based technology, that will be any size up to that same maximum capacity. For medium voltage connections, so here we understand there is no standard definition for medium voltage in Australia, so we have essentially created that definition here, although different networks do use their own definitions for medium voltage. So any connection between 1 and 35 kV we've defined as medium voltage, and again we're asking networks to specify what's the maximum capacity that can be accommodated at the medium voltage connection. And then the high voltage is obviously at greater than 35 kV, which departs somewhat from the Australian standard requirement, because the Australian standard defines HV as greater than 1 kV, but because we've created this new medium voltage definition, it means the high voltage then gets pushed to 35. And then the capacity of those connections will be anything up to 5 megawatts on the east coast or 10 megawatts on the west coast. And then the final category is the registered generator connection, the large size systems, which at this point the technical guidelines will not be covering the technical requirements for registered generator connections. So we have excluded those from the guidelines with respect to the technical requirements, although the process requirements are included. That decision may be revisited at some point in the future. The reason we've left it out is because there's a lot of work going on in that space undertaken by AEMO, AEMC, particularly around the generator performance standards through a rule change. And until that process is complete, there was a strong view by stakeholders that it wasn't appropriate to be setting new technical requirements while that process is underway. Within each of those connection types, we've also defined subtypes, which are called standard and negotiated connections. The words standard and negotiated are taken directly from the National Electricity Rules. Standard connections are generally those that are automatically accepted or expedited by NSPs, where the connection does meet prescribed technical requirements. Standard connections also under the National Electricity Rules have a requirement for a model standing offer to be in place, and the proponent needs to accept those terms of the model standing offer in order for the connection to be deemed standard. At the moment, even though networks do have an option of adopting standard or negotiated connections, that very few networks actually have standard connections in place. And we're not entirely sure of the reason for that. I guess there is an additional process requirement for networks to have a model standing offer in place if they do want to have a standard connection, and the AER does need to approve that. So to date, networks haven't put many standard connections in place. So through this process, we're hoping that there'll be subtypes of connections which are defined as standard. So in the second to last dot point there, I've got an example about a type of standard connection that could arise as a result of this. So it may be the network would develop standard conditions for low voltage connections. It may be the network would develop standard conditions for low voltage connections which are less than 200 kVA, AS4777 compliant inverter-based systems. So that might be a type of connection that a network may choose to develop a standard technical requirement, and that might exist within as a subtype of the low voltage connection. The types of standard connections that might be produced will be being explored in the technical guidelines as part of the next step. But there could be potential opportunities for more than one standard connection type within the main connection type. The technical requirements themselves. So as I've talked about, the Framework and Principles Guideline sets up the structure and does not specify the actual technical requirements. The Framework and Principles Guideline asks for the technical requirements to be either specified as standard technical requirements, which are automatically accepted, or negotiated technical requirements, which will be accepted subject to the connection point itself and the specific characteristics of the proposed connection. The technical requirements may be expressed in terms of the specific technical settings or the outcomes to be achieved. Where specified as outcomes, then the NSP might require the proponent to demonstrate that the outcome has been achieved. So this language that's used here is used generally in that section 5, which sets out the structure of the technical requirements, and then requires NSPs to develop technical requirements under each of the categories that are specified by outcomes or specific technical settings. These will be worked through the next stages of the project. Okay, so to talk about queuing policy, so we have included a chapter in the document which talks about how NSPs need to publish or make available to proponents their queuing policy. This came about because there is inconsistency in the way NSPs treat multiple applications at the same point, especially where those connections in aggregate exceed network limits, usually capacity limits, but there's a range of other technical or physical limitations that can be exceeded if there are too many connections for an existing connection point to handle. The National Electricity Rules, which is different in Western Australia, I should note, but the open access regime on the East Coast under the National Electricity Rules doesn't allow a network to establish any right to capacity. So just because you've put in a connection application, that doesn't necessarily give you a right to capacity. It gives you a right to negotiate a connection, but it does not give you a right to a capacity. So we've asked NSPs to provide queuing policies which provide information to the proponents about the limitations they might expect at particular connection points and options for them to overcome those limitations. And those options might include paying for augmentation, they may include choosing an alternative location on the network, or they may include accessing some sort of shared scheme to the cost of augmentation to be covered by all potential applicants to the same connection point. But we've really left it open in terms of what proponents can do, but the Framework and Principles Guideline asks networks to give proponents their options and to provide information rather than specifying exactly what the network has to do when there are multiple applications at the same connection point. Okay. So for NSPs to comply, we have asked them to structure their technical requirements consistent with the framework and principles and the structure and the table of contents almost that we've set out for the technical requirements. To comply, they need to directly adopt the requirements, which will then now set out in the subsequent technical guidelines. And they will also need to update their own guidelines as soon as practical. We will be doing a review after six months' time to understand how the extent to which that's occurred. So the second major dot point is an important one because we have also given the distribution network service providers the option to adopt an alternative setting. They'll be deemed to comply if they adopt an alternative setting, so long as they can justify that within their own technical guidelines. And justification again means that there's a particular jurisdictional regulations they need to comply with, or if under their own risk assessment they deem that the technical requirement that they want to set has a better outcome in terms of the efficiency from the perspective of both proponents and the network. And that's again outlined in the last dot point specifically that the alternative setting has to promote improved benefits to Australia's electricity system in terms of both network and proponent benefits, risks and costs. So it can't just be an alternative setting because the network has a reduced attitude towards risk. It needs to be that it will promote improved benefits across the system. The document management, review and evaluation, we'll be doing the initial review after 6 months. Then following there we'll be undertaking regular reviews, which are scheduled for every second year. That may be brought forward where there's a legal trigger identified, so that's a trigger that's in terms of a change in legislation that has an impact on the guidelines in terms of that complying with the guidelines is no longer compliant with changes in legislation. Or if there's a technology trigger, so a change in technology means that Australian standards or the equivalent are updated such that the technical requirements need to be revisited. And we've stated that any person can put to ENA and Energy Networks Australia that a trigger has been identified, and then Energy Networks Australia will decide whether a review needs to be undertaken. When a review is instigated, the review will identify potential amendments which better achieve the objectives set out in section 1.1 of the guidelines, amendments which respond to any legal or technology triggers, and then following the potential amendments, they'll be issued to the key stakeholders, and then the final amendments published on Energy Networks Australia's website. The evaluation will be taken every second year, and I guess they'll be offset. The evaluation and reviews will be offset by a year. The purpose of the evaluation is to identify whether there's been network service provider compliance. There'll also be a proponent survey to understand whether from a proponent's perspective, the technical requirements have improved in terms of their clarity, consistency, and whether they avoid unnecessarily onerous requirements, so getting the proponent's view on the effectiveness of the guidelines in achieving that. The evaluation will also identify legal and technology triggers and the high-level findings published on the website publicly, and then that evaluation then informs the review taken the subsequent year, which will then identify the potential amendments. So I wanted to quickly go through some of the key challenges we faced, because not all of the decisions were relatively easy to make in terms of the framework and principle guidelines, and I think it will only get more difficult as we move to the technical guidelines. But some areas where we had disagreements were whether the connection type should be defined by technology size or voltage. We had really mixed views. Like I said before, it was almost a 50-50 split whether it should be technology size or voltage of connection. The considerations, mixed views, some networks already use voltage type. And then I think the key consideration in the end was this lack of agreement around size threshold. So if we started setting size threshold, it was going to be very difficult to agree on size thresholds across all networks because of different characteristics. And so ultimately we landed on voltage level as the main connection type, with NSPs to specify the maximum capacity threshold within that connection type, which may differ by network. We will revisit this in the initial review and see how it then falls out when we develop the connection guidelines. The technology sizes, I guess, will be specified within the technical guidelines. I think I used the example before. We may develop a standard connection type, which is around 200 kVA. That may then be common to all networks, but those sort of capacity issues we'll be exploring in the technical guidelines. Stuart talked about this a little bit earlier, but the use of a medium voltage connection, while most networks did prefer it in the survey, some networks were strongly opposed to it due to not having medium voltage connections and there being no standard definition. And they also argued that a medium voltage connection guideline was likely to be very repetitive and almost identical to either the low voltage or high voltage. We also considered that there might be the potential for NSPs to not adopt a medium voltage guideline if they didn't think it was relevant. So ultimately we did decide to include it, but we will be revisiting that after the development of the technical guidelines, if indeed the medium voltage does look very much like the low voltage or higher voltage, and we realise that there is no need for it. Number 3, the inclusion of technical requirements for registered generator connections. So this is the larger than 5 megawatt systems. In the survey, proponents clearly perceived the technical requirements at this scale as an issue. We got a lot of feedback on that. Some of the other key stakeholders argued that it's covered by, I think it's Schedule 5.4 in the National Electricity Rules in terms of the generator performance standards, which are now under review. And so that was really the key point in the end, that there's so much change going on in this space that it's best to observe that until it's been excluded in terms of technical requirements now. And it may be revisited later, and this indeed could be one of the legal triggers that we talked about in that evaluation section. If there is a change in the generator performance standards rule, then that may trigger the need to review and potentially create registered generator connection technical requirements if there's a need for additional requirements beyond those already specified in the National Electricity Rules. Issue number 4, and I think I did talk about this one earlier, but the concept of the single phase threshold to the basic micro embedded generation connection. So we initially said that the single phase should be set at 10 kVA because that was, when we looked across all the NSPs, that tended to be what the best practice. The move towards 10 kVA was considered best practice. That was our initial scan. And we had a strong desire that these guidelines should be moving should be pushing network service providers to be connecting larger systems, to potentially not be necessarily risk adverse when those risks weren't necessarily likely to manifest. So if one network could accommodate 10 kVA on single phase, why couldn't another? But then I guess we had a lot of feedback around how the issues around a lower size, how that might, the types of risks that may be developed in low density networks. And I think Ergon Energy, SA Power Networks and Essential Energy all have lower thresholds than that for their single phase networks at the moment. So in the end we adopted an option to reduce the single phase basic connection to 5 kVA. But we've asked that networks are very clear on where this applies, which we don't think is necessarily the case at the moment, where networks have different thresholds for different parts of their network. It's not clear to proponents exactly what addresses that will apply to. And so we've asked that the NSPs say which local government areas that particular threshold might apply to. There's also the option to adopt an even lower setting if the network is able to justify that. So I think some networks may take an even lower setting in swerve parts of the network, but they'll need to justify that in terms of the overall efficiency of Australia's electricity system in order to comply with these guidelines. And we'll be reviewing this after the first evaluation. And I think, like with all the settings, if we find that the network service providers are not able to comply with it, we'll be considering alternative settings. But the aim at the first point, I guess, is at least to push towards that best practice and test how far networks actually can go in accommodating larger sizes on the single phase. Number 5 was the differences between Western Australia and the East Coast, and this was I guess a bit of an issue because there are such differences in regulation and how connection types are defined. We have stuck largely with the definitions that are within the national energy market, so those concepts of basic connection, standard connection, negotiated connection. These are all national electricity rule terms. So there are going to be, Western Australia's DNSCs are going to have more issues in directly complying with them, but they will be able to use that justification of local jurisdictional requirements, which means that they won't necessarily apply. But I guess we acknowledge that that's been a challenge in developing this, and we have had that feedback from Western Australian networks. I think broadly that in terms of the principles and the structure of the requirements, we've had agreement that they can apply. So I think in terms of that consistency outcome and getting technical requirements that at least structured the same, we'll be able to get some wins in that space. But we do acknowledge that there'll be more challenges for Western Australian networks in directly complying. The final challenge that I wanted to discuss was the queuing policy. We talked about not including this in the guideline. It does depart a little bit, I guess, including a queuing policy from a technical requirement. It's not necessarily a technical requirement, but it was an area where proponents were asking for increased consistency. Another one of the, I guess, requests is that the queuing policy does allow that place in the queue to give a proponent the right to capacity, and we're not able to do that in the guidelines because that would need a rule change for that to occur. So I think there's the potential for this sort of queuing policy as it's documented here to catalyse networks to potentially ask for that rule change if it is something that continues to be an issue. Because at the moment the decision to include a queuing policy, the decision was to include it, but it states very clearly that the intention of the queuing policy is not to reserve capacity, rather to provide proponents information around the potential constraints that may be observed in the point at which they want to connect. So it's an information providing queuing policy rather than a capacity providing queuing policy. Okay, Stuart, I'll hand back over to you for next steps.
Thanks very much. So just want to take you through how we're actually going to go forward with this. So now that we've actually launched this document, we're now looking at actually starting the project to develop the first of the technical guidelines. Now, based on the feedback that we got through the process, we're looking at starting on the low voltage connection. However, we'll take that probably through the steering committee first just to make sure that that's the exact way we go. But based on most of the stakeholder feedback we got, or the majority of stakeholder feedback we got, was that was the one that they'd like us to start off with first. The whole idea will be to start that off with a survey in June. We'll have a steering committee meeting in July to go through that and then start drafting that document. We're looking at trying to get stakeholders together to actually to help us develop that document. So we're looking for some people that have got some keen interest in helping us put this together, to actually engage with us around that, and potentially putting like a technical advisory group together to assist in putting that together. And then the whole idea of the first of those, we're looking at finalising the first of the technical guidelines around October and launching that. The other guidelines, once we've actually kicked the first one off, we'll then be launching those, starting the work program in those in a staggered manner. So the whole idea is they're halfway through the process. Once we've kicked the one off for the low voltage and we're on the track, we'll then start getting into the next one, and so we can actually deliver all the guidelines by the scheduled time frame of around March 2019. In terms of how we'd really like to encourage people to engage with us further around the guidelines, and particularly the technical guidelines. And so, and if you've got any also questions around this guideline itself, I'd be very happy for you to contact myself or get in touch with Energy Networks Australia to actually provide any feedback or issues that you've got, or would just like to chat. Also, both Melanie and I will be at EN218 next week, and if you're there as well, if you have the opportunity, please come up and actually discuss both this document and also the subsequent program of work with us. I'd certainly like to thank all of you people online today, as well as those who engaged with us to get this guideline up and where we need to go going forward. And I really look forward to working with you all in establishing those new the subsequent technical guidelines. I'm now going to, myself and Melanie are just going to go through some of the questions that were actually raised through part of this process, and quickly start answering some of those until we run out of time. And if we don't get to all of them that actually come through on the system at the moment, the whole idea is we'll try and come back to those separately afterwards and provide that in written detail on our website. The first question that came up was around the standard connection services as specified to Chapter 5A of the NER. This does not apply to transmission businesses or connections greater than 5 megawatts. I think that's correct, and that's why we haven't gone. We're looking at TNSPs as part of this process. The only reason why that could come up that was raised by some. That is, with the connection standards, the work that AEMO is doing, there was discussions by some stakeholders through this process that it would be good to extend these guidelines to link in or match in with the work that goes on there. We haven't taken that any further. It was just feedback that was actually garnered through that process of the engagement. Mel, did you want to go to the next?
Yep. So I've got a question. Chapter 5 is a technical requirements overview. So I guess I'm taking that as a suggestion. Maybe it should be labelled overview because it doesn't actually include the technical requirements themselves, and that's correct. That it is an overview or more about a structure of technical requirements than the requirements themselves. I think the next two are sort of details, which I'll skip for now. The Justin B question, Stuart, do you want to answer that one?
And that was probably then comes back to yes. This question basically is the basic connection service limits may be appropriate for urban networks, but will cause issues on swirl or single phase rural networks. And again, yes, we realise that and that was part of the process where we identified that if there was an issue in some of those areas, and justification by the network could actually be made that alternate settings needed to be put in place, and that could happen through this process. It just needs to be justified why that would be different to on a swirl line or single-phase rural network compared to what it would be like in what would be required in an urban network.
Yeah, I think this whole process is about balancing that need to push networks to constantly review and making sure they're not being too risk averse, but also to try and achieve consistency at the same time. So we've got to balance those two things, and we don't want to provide too many get-out clauses, if you like. So we've got to be wary of doing that and testing all these assumptions as we go on. So do you really need to have a lower limit on swirl lines? Is that really what we want? So I think in developing the framework and principles guideline, this was sort of the first test of that sort of process, but as we go into the technical requirements, that sort of issue about balancing the need for consistency based on the need to versus the need for networks to have different requirements based on their unique characteristics, we're going to face more and more of those issues that we're going to have to contend with.
The next two questions probably sort of go together. One is the first one was around incorporating these guidelines as an Australian standard, and secondly around the compliance requirements, because it's at the moment it's seen as a voluntary code. There was a reason why we actually decided to do this as a guidelines to start off with. One was the acceptance by networks to actually do this, and two, developing these as national guidelines is more flexible in terms of if we need to update and change these based on what's going on, and so it allows us to be more reactive to some of those issues and change. Yes, it could have issues around the compliance, which is why we've actually put and talking to stakeholders, the importance of actually having a system in terms to actually evaluate how that compliance is actually occurring. And we have identified that further down the track, once these become set going forward, and there are issues in that area, that there is potential for these actually to go into the standard, or it could actually be listed within a regulation or something like that. However, if we can make sure that we think the best outcome is if we can encourage the compliance by the networks utilising this process, and we actually go through then it's actually a better outcome because it makes it a more flexible system. No? Yeah,
question around the medium voltage definition aligns with the range specified in Table 3 of Australian Standard 60038. And that is probably the reason why we used it. So I guess that's a comment, and thank you for that. I guess it's supportive of the medium voltage definition.
Next one goes back to that compliance again. Yes, it's going to be Energy Networks Australia who will be looking at that or doing that on behalf of the system. So, but we'll still be working with some of our key stakeholders on the steering committee to actually reporting some of that stuff back as well. So the whole idea is to have full transparency on when we're actually doing those reviews and the compliance around that.
And there will be a third-party evaluation as well, which will be commissioned by ENA and its members, but it will be undertaken by a third party to do the proponent survey as well as the compliance check. So you've got a comment, once DNSPs establish a standard connection services model standing offers, you've got a comment, once DNSPs establish a standard connection services model standing offers, binding NER obligations and AER enforcement applies. So I think that's a comment, and it's a useful comment because this is really one of the reasons we decided to utilise this standard connection mechanism within the rules, because once a standard connection is in place, then the AER then has a level of enforcement. They review the model standing offer which contain the technical requirements and they need to check that they are fair and reasonable. And so if through this process we're encouraging networks to use the standard connection mechanism in the rules, then we then bring AER into play, and it provides, I guess, more scrutiny of those connections itself, which currently that standard model, the standard connection process isn't being used by all networks, so it's explicitly intended to encourage that and AER involvement. Okay, so then there's a comment, yes, but there's no requirement to establish a standard connection service, and that is true. That the way that the framework and principles document is written is that it's optional for networks to include a standard connection within the technical requirements, but they don't have to. That each of the connections could just remain as negotiated connections. That's where we've left it at the moment. I guess we'll be exploring that concept further through the technical guidelines development. Our understanding is that there's a number of networks who are looking at developing standard model offers at the moment within some of these larger connection type definitions. So we'll be looking at working with them to try to understand if we can develop a further standard connection that could be consistent across networks. So that will be part of the next phase. But trying to there is no requirement at the moment. That is correct. A comment: 10 kVA on single phase has the same impact on voltage rise as 60 kVA on three-phase due to neutral unbalanced current. We should be encouraging more three-phase systems than larger single-phase systems to maximise the penetration. So I think I'll have to. That's a useful comment. I'll have to take that one on notice to see. But I guess that's a questioning why are we including that single-phase and how we then might discourage that through this process. I think we'll have to consider that one. I don't think I can answer that at this time. Do these guidelines delve into the control monitoring system information exchange too from the proponent and the related data model and communication mechanism as IEC 61850, it's already been done in some countries. There are several existing revised and emerging parts of 61850 specifically dealing with various DER as well as BESS. So I think in terms of communications and data protocols, that's specifically a section we've required within the technical requirements. The exact requirements and alignment to standards will be part of the development of the technical guidelines, so we'll certainly be taking that into account in that process. A comment about a medium voltage connection, I think we'll take that one on notice. It's a bit detailed to be covering here. So the earlier question about DNSP compliance should more properly be called adoption. The value of this work is if all networks adopt the principles and then the latter guidelines. Presumably it has only got to this stage because of high level support.
And I'd concur with that statement. It's it has got to this state because we had the support at the highest levels of each of the network companies.
Yeah, and that will be. I mean, that's a continuing process as we develop the technical guidelines, trying to maintain that support and increase it so that we agree that the most valuable will be achieved where all networks can adopt not just the framework and principles, but the technical requirements.
Yep. And going forward in terms of the compliance to these or adoption of these, that will actually be reported back to both the ENA board and also the CEO forum, which is all of our members as part of that as well.
Okay, and then there's a final question. Is there a consideration for pre-calculated customer contributions in the standard model standing offers? How else will networks be able to process application in 10 business days? So I assume that refers to the NER requirements for processing of a standard model offer. We haven't, in terms, I think we talked about process, but the guidelines won't be considering process or connection charges, customer contributions at this stage. But I might further look into that issue and see if there's a way we can address that, because it sounds like by encouraging standard connections, we may have introduced we could potentially be introducing a process issue, I guess is what this person is saying. So we'll have a look at that one.
I've just cognizant of the time, so we've just gone over the time period. So I'm looking at closing this down now. and I'd like to thank everyone again for all their contributions as part of this today. Also, as part of that, if you want to have a look at the actual guideline, it's actually on our website now. So again, follow the link that was actually provided within the presentation to actually go and look at that. And again, I'd really love to encourage you all to engage with us as we take this forward now to start developing the technical guidelines. And also, there are still issues that we've got around this one. Part of the process of actually developing those technical guidelines, as I said, we built this as part of a consensus process to try and get the best outcomes for all of the different stakeholders in actually developing this. We may discover that some things may need to be tweaked as part of that in going forward, and so that's something that we're going to be looking at as going forward. So the whole idea of these aren't set in stone or anything like that. The whole idea is that we're over the long period, the whole idea is we want to make sure that these are right for what we need and actually can be adjusted as things change. So thank you very much. And last but not least, the presentation material will actually be provided up on our website for people to come and get. I would say though that they may be not up on our website until a week and a half's time. The reason for that is EN 218's next week, and I know my comms people are very, very pushed at the moment. However, if people wanted to email me directly, I'm quite happy to send a copy of those slides to you in advance, so before they go up on the public website. So very happy to send those through. So thank you very much.